healthy classrooms, the need for proper ventilation. Ventilation is an important aspect of a healthy indoor environment as it ensures adequate airflow within buildings. One way to test the ventilation within a building is to measure the amount of carbon dioxide levels as high CO2 levels correlate with inadequate ventilation. According to ASHRA, CO2 concentrations should be no higher than 800 parts per million in a building, as outdoor levels consist of about 300 to 550 ppm. Consequently, carbon dioxide levels higher than 800 may lead to a range of health risks, such as fatigue and dizziness, and even increased cardiac output and elevated blood pressure, according to the USDA. But why is this important? Well, on average, a typical student spends about 1,000 hours each year in schools. Thus, schools are an important discussion regarding environmental conditions because students spend so much time indoors. But within multiple studies regarding ventilation levels in students' performance, there is actually a noticeable gap. And this gap is the effects of ventilation on high school students ages 14 to 18. Now, for example, in a study done by Javier Chagansky's research in the Journal of Indoor Air, students ages 5 to 7 were the main focus of the study. Now, in a study done by Thordella in the Journal of Indoor Air, students 9 to 10 were the main focus of the study. And in a study done by Peterson, also in the Journal of Indoor Air, students ages 10 to 12 were the main focus of the study. Now, there are clear developmental differences in between high schoolers and elementary and middle schoolers, as high schoolers are faced with academic level that is more rigorous. Thus, it is really important to address this gap. However, it is, of course, difficult to evaluate the effects of the entire range of 14-year-olds to 18-year-olds. Thus, instead, I will be focusing specifically on 14-year-olds to 16-year-olds, as their schedule tends to be more flexible than compared to the upperclassmen, thus allowing this experiment to interfere with their class time, as teachers were able to set aside time for academic testing. Therefore, the question guiding this experiment is, does increased ventilation rates within classrooms positively affect academic performance from students ages 14 to 16? Now, to determine the format of my experiment, I had to review several studies, and we will today be focusing on 2 studies. Now, this first study is one done by J. Rosebach, also in the Journal of Indoor Air. And in this study, a temporary intervention was used to evaluate the effects of increased ventilation by increasing outdoor air supply and controlling the amount of mechanical ventilation measured by CO2 concentrations. So this study introduced the idea that you can measure ventilation within a room by CO2 concentrations. In another study done by D. Wardella, this approach was used in a similar way. However, they took it a step further by evaluating ventilation at 3 levels: regular, worse, and better. Now, it may be seen as unethical to put a student in a worse condition, as this can lead to more health risks. So in my study, I will instead be focusing only on regular and better conditions. Now, after reviewing several studies, I was able to determine my own research method that would be most effective in evaluating the effects of ventilation. And that research method is a cross-field experiment with an independent variable consisting of existing and manipulated airflow, and the dependent variable consisting of student scores. Now, this experiment within the triangulation method also consisted of a pretest and a post-test. Now, in the pretest, there were 2 different sections. There was the ventilation pretest and the academic pretest. The ventilation pretest just consisted of ventilation measurements within the classroom that were already existing there. And the academic testing was done in those existing ventilation levels. Now, the post-test consisted of ventilation levels that were increased, and academic testing was done within these increased ventilation levels. Now, the instrument that I used to measure the amount of CO2 in the room was a Aeronet calibration carbon dioxide sensor. And this worked by collecting CO2 levels in 5-minute increments throughout a non-dispersive infrared sensor. And throughout this, it provided an accurate reading of CO2 in the room. Now it comes to the question, how am I going to test academic achievement? Well, This is inspired by a study done by M.J. Mendel in the Journal of Indoor Air, and they use the STAR test as a way to measure academic achievement. Now, throughout this study, I learned that standardized testing could be used as a way to accurately measure academic achievement. Thus, I chose specifically the PSAT. So the PSAT format allows the experiment to stay consistent throughout the conditions, as the same students can take both a different yet similar test in the pre-test and post-test. Also, the test should be neither too difficult nor easy, as it is based off of the average academic ability of students ages of 14 to 16. However, this test usually has 4 sections, but because of time and scheduling issues, only 2 sections, the reading section and the grammar section, were used in this experiment. So it comes to the question, how am I going to increase airflow? Well, after speaking to the maintenance supervisor here at this school, I learned that each HVAC system within the school is set on a recirculation level, meaning that there is actually no fresh air coming into the room, but rather the air is being recirculated every few hours. But also throughout this expert advisor, I learned that each classroom has a manual damper that acts like a door and allows fresh air to enter the room. Thus, I concluded the best way to allow increased airflow into the room is to open up this manual damper within these classrooms so fresh air could come into the room. Now, in order to determine the effectiveness of ventilation levels on students' academic performance, the study was divided into 2 further groups, which was specifically freshman and sophomore. Now, in the freshman group, this was divided into 2 more groups, which consisted of 6 students and 9 students, based off of their respective English classes. So this experiment also was done over the span of 2 days. Now, the first group of students both group of students took the pretest on day 1. And the pretest consisted of the reading section, which was a 60-minute test with 47 questions. Now, on day 2, the same group of students took the post-test, which was a different version of the reading section. However, this time the post-test was in the altered air conditioning levels. Now, for the sophomore groups, this was done a little differently, as the experiment only consisted over 1 day, and this was because of scheduling issues. Now, this group of students was divided into 2 more groups, one with 13 students and the other one with 13 students. Now, in the pretest, one group of students took the grammar section in the existing levels. And the second group of students, which was a different group of students, they took the post-test. But this was done on the same day. So unlike the freshman group, this had different students in each the pretest and the post-test. So now let's look at the results from the freshman group. As you can see here, this is a chart of the CO2 levels in the room. Now looking here, there seems to be about an average of 800 ppm in the room with students in the existing level. However, when looking at the room without the students, there seems to be an average of a difference of 200 ppm. Now this shows that even though it may seem like there's adequate ventilation within a room, actually whenever you occupy a space with more students, that ventilation becomes worse and those CO2 levels just go higher. Well, on the other side, the 2 columns show the ventilation levels with the increased airflow. And as you can see, there is little difference between the room with students and without students, showing how the magnitude to which airflow can decrease carbon dioxide levels. Now let's look at the scores of the students. So as you can see here, these are the correct number of responses in the pre-test and post-test. And because the students took both the pre-test and the post-test, I was able to look at their individual score differences. Now, for the first group of students in the existing condition, the average number of correctly answered questions consisted of 25.5 questions out of the 47. And in the increased airflow, that average increased to about 31.116 questions. Thus, there was a percent increase of about 18% per correctly answered question for this group. Furthermore, when comparing the separate individual scores, there was an on-average increase of 5.33 questions answered correctly in the altered ventilation levels. Now let's look at the second group of freshmen. The average number of correct responses from the second group was about 29 out of the 47 questions. When looking at the scores in the increased ventilation classroom, there was an average number of 31.16 correct responses. Thus, for this group, there was a percent increase of about 9% of correctly answered questions between the pre-test and post-test. Additionally, when looking at the individual scores, this score seemed to increase by 2.625 correctly answered questions on the individual scores. So now let's look at the results from the sophomore group. Now this is a similar table to the freshman group, but as you can see here, these parts per meter or parts per million were way higher, and the average was about 1,400 parts per million. And when comparing the score without the student, or the levels without the student, there is a clear difference, showing that once again, even though it seems like there may be adequate ventilation, it doesn't quite really, whenever you add students to the setting, those carbon dioxide levels significantly increase. And also there's the showing the levels with the conditions that were with the increased airflow level. And once again, you can still see that there is a decrease in CO2 concentrations. So now let's look at the testing from the sophomores. Because both the sophomores were not able to take both the pre-test and the post-test, I was only able to look at their average score differences. Now for the pre-test, there was an average score of 30.667 correct responses out of the 47 questions. Now in the post-test, this increased to about 32.417 correct responses out of the 47 questions. Thus, there was about a percent increase of 5.706 of responses in this section. However, once again, the individual scores were not able to be looked at. So now this brings us to the discussion part of the experiment. To test significance, I chose to use a sample t-test. So for the sample t-test, the null hypothesis consisted of no average difference between the pre-test and the post-test scores. And the alternative hypothesis consisted of average score differences being greater than 0 between the pre-test and post-test. And to determine statistical significance, I chose an alpha level of 0.05 or 5%. Now, for the first group of sophomores, because we weren't able to look at the specific differences in the scores, a two-sample t-test was used. And this two-sample t-test yielded a p-value of 0.520717. Now, when comparing this p-value, since it is greater than the alpha level of 0.05, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. Thus, there is not convincing evidence that increased airflow causes an increase in students' academic scores. However, for the freshman group of set of data, I was able to use a one-sample t-test looking at the individual differences. Now, this one-sample t-test yielded a p-value of 0.002194. And when comparing this p-value to the alpha level, because the p-value is less than the alpha level of 0.05, we actually are able to reject the null hypothesis, thus concluding that increased airflow does increase student academic scores. So thus, the two-sample t-test proved to be not statistically significant, and the one-sample t-test proved to be statistically significant. Now, what are the limitations within this experiment? Well, a clear limitation is not being able to replicate the experimental method used on the freshman also on the sophomore. And why is this? Well, there was actually an uncontrollable factor within the experiment. Several months prior to the experiment, a pipe bursted within the school, causing flooding. Because of that flooding, there was increased construction, which caused several doors to be open. However, with these doors open, there was an increase of fresh airflow into the school, causing the CO2 levels to greatly decrease. So to proceed with this experiment, I had to wait until these CO2 levels returned back to normal, thus pushing back the experiment. And because of this, it caused a schedule for teachers to become limited, so only the freshman group could do both the pre-test and the post-test. Now, what is the further research? If I was to do this research again, perhaps it would be replicated with college students. When looking at the secondary sources, once again, several elementary students and middle school students were used, and there was a clear lack in high school students and also college students. These college students are also in classrooms for several hours on end, so it is extremely important that they also are tested so we can make sure that all students get adequate airflow. Furthermore, this experiment should be extended to more schools. Only one school was used in this experiment. Thus, if you could open up the experiment to more schools, you could see how airflow within older buildings, newer buildings, and even more students really affects everybody. Now, this study has several implications towards improving the learning environment of students. The study presents the idea that schools should focus on providing their students with properly ventilated classrooms. The classroom environment plays such an important role in the performance of students beyond academic testing, so it is necessary that schools have a properly ventilated classroom to ensure a healthy environment. However, it is understandable that schools may not be able to fully ventilate their classrooms as frequently as recommended due to cost and efficiency reasons. So if schools were to focus on where to ventilate their rooms, they should focus on whenever they are administering the important standardized testing such as the SAT or PSAT. Students during these tests are forced to stay in a classroom for several hours on end, so it is extremely important to make sure that they have adequate airflow. So this brings us to the conclusion of the experiment. The research question, does increased ventilation affect students' academic performance in the classroom, can be answered through an individual analysis of scores on standardized testing in a pre-test and post-test of existing and altered air conditions. From this experiment, the results from the freshman group of individual scores was found to be statistically significant. Thus, yes, increased ventilation does positively affect students ages 14's academic performance in classrooms. Also, this research helps fill in the gap regarding the lack of research with students, older students, and as they were used as the main focus group for this experiment. So at the end of the day, no matter their age, all students deserve a healthy learning environment that is setting them up for success beyond the academic field. Therefore, schools should weigh great importance on improved ventilation, whether it is by adjusting their HVAC system or simply cracking a window open. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We do have a few questions for you. First off, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important for informing your new understanding?
Well, because I wasn't able to replicate the same research method for the freshmen and sophomores, when looking at the results, the freshman group of data proved to be statistically significant. And once again, I mentioned that if I was to do this research again, I would have done the sophomore group with the same research method so I could look at their individual scores. But because, once again, the uncontrollable factor of the flooding and time constraints, the sophomore group yielded to be not statistically significant. So I was forced to only look at the freshman group, which proved to be statistically significant and helped to fill in also the gap, but whilst also proving that increased airflow does affect student scores.
Another question, what are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
One real-world implication is schools should really focus on ventilating their classrooms, specifically during these important tests. For example, juniors can only take the PSAT once a year, so it is really important that they are in a condition that provides them the best possible scoring, and whether that means a really healthy classroom. So schools should greatly consider whether it's just opening up the damper or not setting the classroom on recirculation to ensure that fresh airflow comes into that classroom and the carbon dioxide levels don't build up within the 5-hour test. And this allows students to have their best possible academic performance within that test.
And lastly, think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
Well, when initially looking at what experiment I wanted to conduct, I was interested in the effects of HEPA filters in a classroom. And when researching, I found that HEPA filters are related to airborne viruses such as the COVID-19 virus. And I also found that within a classroom, it may be difficult to try to look at those HEPA filters, as that is kind of going into the medical field rather than just the experimental field. So definitely, I think it would be extremely interesting to see how HEPA filters can affect the room, and whether I think this research really opens up that maybe opening of the dampers can also decrease carbon dioxide levels, but also lessen these airborne viruses. So once again, students are in an academically safe space, but also the environment is healthy for them to succeed.